and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, running its program on Central Asia. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on 3 decades of Western engagement in Eurasia. We decided to hold it in December for obvious reasons. 30 years ago, on the 8th of December in Eurasia, the 3 Slavic republics dissolved the USSR and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. On 21st of December in Almaty, 11 republics, including all 5 Central Asian ones, founded the CIS again. And on the 25th of December, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned and the red Soviet flag was lowered over Kremlin. And that December was like a red line itself, dividing before and after the Soviet and the post-Soviet independence that came with a plunge into market, intense nation building, integration into the international system. The West was strongly involved in developments in Eurasia, and I'll use this term Eurasia the way we use it at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. So sort of the post-Soviet space without Russia, trying to steer the new independent states in the direction of markets and liberal democracies. So we thought December this year gives us a very good vantage point to look back and reflect on the 3 decades of engagement, but not just for the sake of reflection, but also for better understanding of the current moment we're in. And personally, I have a feeling that we are somewhat at a watershed moment again, less pronounced, less clear than in December 1991. That sort of the tides are changing. We see a resurgence of illiberalism in the East and in the West. Sorry for the Cold War terminology. The West is undergoing a confidence crisis. Russia and West are locked in a rivalry in Eurasia again. And it's very scary to hear discussions about the possibility of Russian invasion in Ukraine. China weighs in more and more. So it's, you know, it's something important. Something important seems to be happening. And it is a highly ambitious agenda that I've just outlined, but we have a fantastic panel with us to tackle it. All our speakers are not only long-time, very astute observers of developments in Eurasia, but also practitioners who were or have been directly involved in efforts that here we sort of very broadly define as Western engagement. Let me introduce them in the order I'll ask them to give initial remarks. We'll start with Ambassador George Kroll, who is a career member of Senior Foreign Office, adjunct professor at the US Naval War College, and associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And let me add, a very big friend of the program on Central Asia. He joined the Foreign Service in 1982 and had been dealing with Eurasia since. During the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990-1992, he represented the United States in the Baltic republics and Northwest Russia, and subsequently helped open new US diplomatic missions in Belarus and Ukraine. Throughout the 90s, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission, Charge d'Affaires, the US Embassy in Minsk. He was Special Assistant to the Ambassador at Large for newly independent states, helping the Ambassador at Large to formulate policies toward the state of the former Soviet Union. He was also Director of the Office of Russian Affairs at the US State Department. In 1992-2002, he was Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the US Embassy in Moscow. In 2003-2006, he was US Ambassador to Belarus. In 2008-2010, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the US State Department, overseeing Central Asia. In 2011-2014, he was US Ambassador to Uzbekistan. 2015-2018, US Ambassador to Kazakhstan. Our second speaker is also a diplomat and former ambassador to Belarus, and also a scholar. Dr. Nigel Gould Davis is Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia and Editor of Strategic Survey at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Prior to joining the IISS, he taught and conducted research on international relations in Asia. From 2010 till 2014, he held senior government relations roles in the energy sector in Central and Southeast Asia. 2010, he served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where his roles including serving as head of the economics department in Moscow, ambassador to Belarus, and project director in the strategy unit. 1996-2000, he taught politics and international relations at Oxford University. Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Lee Adams, who is currently working for PACT, a nonprofit international development organization, as the director for monitoring, evaluation, and learning for civil society and media programs worldwide. Previously, she served as senior director for strategy, development, and learning at Freedom House in DC, where she led organizational learning and applied research initiatives. She entered the applied democracy research field when she was a fellow in the learning division of the Center for Excellence in Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at the USAID. Prior to that, Laura was in academia for 15 years, and most recently here at Harvard University as director of the program on Central Asia and the Caucasus. So Laura, it's so great to have you with us. Our last but not least speaker is Bruce Pannier. Bruce is a longtime journalist and correspondent covering Central Asia. He currently writes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's blog, Kishlok Ovozi, and appears regularly on the Majlis podcast for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Prior to joining it in 1997, Bruce worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague. In 1992, he led a sociological project in Central Asia, sponsored by the University of Manchester and the Soros Cultural Initiative Foundation. During that time, he lived in villages in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and has amazing stories from that period. Bruce studied in Tashkent State University in the summer of 1990 and studied at Columbia University under Professor Allworth. He has also written for The Economist, Jane's Intelligence, Oxford Analytica, Freedom House, The Cairo Review, the FSU Oil and Gas Monitor, and Energo Weekly. So welcome to the panel. And without further ado, let me invite Ambassador Kroll to kick off our discussion. George, what are your reflections on these 30 years of Western engagement?
Well, thank you, Nargis, and thank you for inviting me to join you all. Of course, 30 years ago, and I've been thinking a lot about it and speaking in various venues, and it is rather overwhelming, as it was at the time too, but overwhelming now to think of that and that period and the like. And as we're talking about Western engagement with Eurasia, being someone who was in the field, I was in Leningrad, St. Petersburg at the time when the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Even before the 25th of December, when the flag was lowered, at least as an American diplomat, it was becoming clear that power had shifted, certainly after the August coup of that year, from Gorbachev to Yeltsin. It was very hard for the American leadership, the administration, to basically accept that, because it was a frightening prospect to see this huge country, nuclear armed and the like, on the verge of a collapse. And there was a great deal of trepidation about what the results of that would be for security in Europe and for the United States. And certainly the ties that had bound the Bush administration to Mikhail Gorbachev were quite strong and personal. Less so with Boris Yeltsin, and certainly not very much with any of the other republics of the Soviet Union. And I know we're focusing on Eurasia, and so to look at that is just to say that there was very little contact with these other republics, whether you're talking about Belarus, Ukraine, and Central Asia and the Caucasus, and very little knowledge, understanding from the ground. I mean, after all, this was in many respects a terra incognito, because it would have been a closed society in many respects, and many of these republics were sort of off limits to diplomats, or at least they were very controlled visits and things of this nature. And although things had opened up under glasnost, and the United States was just opening, for instance, a consulate in Kiev, we had no diplomatic establishments anywhere else, and yet there were, starting in the 1990, American diplomats allowed to travel around rather freely throughout the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, there was very little understanding of either the peculiarities of anything out there, and so when it all ended, as it were, there was this great rush to engage, which was overwhelming for, I would say, the Western countries, and I would say the United States, but even more so, if not for the countries themselves that emerged. And in some respects, it was kind of like the Europeans coming to the American continent and meeting with the cultures of native peoples there, with this idea that they need to be saved from something and the like, with very little knowledge or appreciation of exactly what they were, what the conditions were on the ground. Russia, of course, was able to assume the Soviet ministries and the like, and in Moscow there had been a lot of contact, if you will, with diplomats and the like, not so, or with businesses and like, not so in the other republics. And again, this is very different from Eastern and Central Europe, because those countries, while they were, part of the Soviet world, they were republics that had their ministries, had their contacts with the world. And so therefore, when those countries sort of became, in 1989 and different, and the regimes were changing, the Western engagement with them was of a different nature, because they were more used to dealing with and had the institutions somewhat to deal with it, but it was difficult anyways. And so when the United States was engaging with these, it was taking the example of what they were doing in Eastern and Central Europe and trying to transfer that as a model to the former Soviet Union, but without that kind of, it was a different world. And similarly, in the countries where this engagement was occurring, they did not have these institutions or connections or contacts or familiarity with dealing with all this. So when I was sent down to Kiev, for instance, in 1992, we were opening up our embassy. First, the foreign ministry of Kiev had about 10 people in it. The defense ministry, 3. They didn't have a defense ministry to speak of. And yet the United States and other countries were sort of treating them as that they had been born as fully developed and the like. And we were sending tens, how many engagements with them on demarches and diplomatic communications. It was overwhelming to them. And also, it wasn't just the government, but there was a descending on these countries of private individuals, investors, business people. I remember when I was in St. Petersburg, it was flooded with people thinking that somehow they had all different intentions, but they wanted a piece of, as it were, the action, if not the real estate. And these governments, local and had to cope with all of this as to what to do with them and how to accommodate them in certain ways. And then you had all of the non-governmental organizations that were coming in, we, from the government side, there was the U.S., the military, the intelligence services, not just, and all the panoply of departments of agriculture and treasury and the like, all wanting to engage with these countries. And so it was bound, the expectations on both sides were very difficult to meet. And for the United States, the view was, first of all, there's the security, and those are the countries that had nuclear weapons. How do you ensure that they are dealt with? In this case, brought back to Russia and things of this nature. Those were priorities. And then there was a big priority of what was thought to be a humanitarian possible catastrophe. And also on the background of that, at least in the United States, there was an economic downturn and Bush's reelection campaign of 1992, and there really wasn't a stomach to spend a lot of money in this area. And we just didn't also have expertise, nor did anyone, in dealing with these countries and their societies and knowing what they were about and who's who and what are the power relationships. And I remember even the NGOs or, IFC, World Bank, AID, our own one, they all had experience in people dealing with Africa and Asia, not in this area. They didn't have Russian speakers. They were coming from Africa and landing in Kiev and like, well, what are we supposed to do here? And also many of the people that were involved were young. They may have had Russian language, but that was it. They knew nothing really about economics, business, transformation, yet they came as missionaries, to try to promote something they themselves didn't really understand. And then in certain countries like Ukraine, you had, and the Baltic republics was the diaspora coming in. Both those that were in the government service, but also those that weren't, that were going to come and, help to save, as it were, the land of their ancestors, and but they came from places like Chicago and Ottawa and whatever, and they were Canadians and Americans and elsewhere not really understanding. When I was in Kiev, I had a Ukrainian American saying, "These aren't Ukrainians we're dealing with; these are Soviets," and with a great deal of distaste. And of course, for the Ukrainians in Ukraine, they were looking at these people and said, "Who are these? They speak some weird form of Ukrainian and they're trying to tell us what to do," and the like. And there was, there were these kinds of conflicts. If you talk about Central Asia, there wasn't much in the way of a diaspora coming in, but you also had other influences than if you will, the West. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, China in a very big way, looking at Central Asia as this is an open territory, an open area to engage in. And it was quite overwhelming for the governments who again were trying to protect their own politics and their own ways that they understood, and also the population that was sort of overwhelmed as to what all this meant. They wanted a better life for themselves, but it wasn't going to happen overnight. And so these kind of engagements of these cultures and we could then see spinning out through the next 30 years. So I would say that to understand what has happened in the last 30 years is also to look back and see what that world was like when that first engagement was made, because a lot of impressions were made, and good and bad and things of this nature. It just happened this way, and the consequences are what we see now. So I think I'll stop there, in a way, having set the scene as how I saw it from my vantage point in the 90s, and we can engage with others about where we were in the next 30 years and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, it was overwhelming on both sides. Well, I was in Central Asia at the time, and in Almaty, I remember that period quite well, and it was chaotic. But at the same time, there was kind of this promise in the air. We all felt that something big is happening, and the new independence, and kind of new life, and all that. So, what do you remember? What your expectations were at the time?
Well, I was my own personal expectations were to try, as a diplomat on the ground, was trying to resolve conflicts that were managing all this inflow of people from the United States, in my instance, and dealing with the local government that was, and the people there that had to deal with them and act as somehow a mediator. When I deal with the people in the government, because we have a problem there, because I didn't have that background of as a Ukrainian, because many Ukrainian Americans, practically all that were sort of in our service, foreign and elsewhere, went to Kiev, and again, so that this was a matter that my own expectations were is recognizing how difficult this would be, and trying to, if you will, kind of slow things down, trying to explain to my colleagues, certainly back in Washington, how difficult it was for the people I had to deal with in the field. I remember going back to, again, when I was in Ukraine, and saying, look, can we just slow down the fire hose of demarches to the Ukrainian government? They can't handle it. And the answer I got back was, they wanted to be independent. This is what it's like if you're an independent country. I mean, I had to deal with that attitude. And in Central Asia, I think as well, there was this sense of, we would overwhelm them by sending all kinds of people in and wanting to cut deals and getting things signed and everything. And they really didn't have the time to sort of think about it and what was really being asked of them and things. So again, my expectations were pretty, was like, okay, the future is, this is their country, these countries, they will have to develop themselves, but how to try to act as a mediator in some way so that there would be less misunderstandings between what both sides were doing, but trying to explain to both sides, look, this is falling on deaf ears, or you are inadvertently irritating these people so much. And so I didn't really have time to think big thoughts. I mean, that was kind of the academics and everything, or those that would come in with their background in academics and ideology or something like democracy promotion, and that here, how do you create political parties and media and things of this nature? Well, there's already a deep background of this in those countries themselves, and it's not so easy to sort of go in and give and as it were transform them in what is a short period of time. And from the American perspective, it's like every 4 years you have a new administration or a new secretary or new people there that want to show the Congress and everyone the successes that they have, and things like this don't work so quickly. And in some respects, a wise man in the US government once said, if you want it bad, you'll get it bad. So that kind of was a guiding principle for me. Anyways, I hope that answers somewhat of your question.
Yes. Thank you. Well, a lot of moving parts, but let's move to Nigel, who is an academic slash diplomat. Nigel, what's your take?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to take part in this event, and George has already set out a vivid portrait in words that brought me a nostalgia rush back to the tumultuous early 90s as he was describing that, and the cast of events and characters caught up in that swirl of the immediate post-Soviet period. It's absolutely fascinating. So let me just make 3 points in a few minutes, and maybe 1 or 2 provocations as well for the sake of discussion. The first point is just to return again, as George has, to the end of 1991 and just set out some elements of what was going on there, just to impress upon us the sheer scale and unprecedented character of what went on then. It was as if there was a sort of a big bang in the whole region, this great entity, the Soviet Union, breaking up into 15 separate pieces, molten material, as it were, 15 parts of it spewing out in all directions, still sort of molten, unformed or semi-formed, spinning out, seeking new choices, new trajectories. And it's that journey, I suppose, that we're reflecting on 3 decades on. Now, the background factors, of course, that led to that were the breakdown of centralized authoritarian power, partly intended, partly unintended, of the whole perestroika and glasnost project. But let's recall, particularly in this December, the precipitating events that led directly and immediately to the end of the Soviet Union. As I see it, above all, if I had to point to one event, it was the Ukrainian independence referendum of the 1st of December, 1991. And led a week later to that meeting of the heads of the three Eastern Slavic republics, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia at Bielorussia. Those were as I see it, the two key developments. And I'll come back to that at the end of our remarks, but set out that marker there. And what followed, of course, was the beginning of this unprecedentedly difficult and complex transition. Many dimensions, a new political order, new choices about economic system as well, the building of state capacity, republics becoming countries, new social identity, the process not just of state formation, but identity formation as well. So this journey from authoritarianism, from planning, or the remnants of planning after the reform of perestroika, the journey to, again, from essentially Soviet to a national identity as well. All of this taking place in deepening crisis conditions. Even in the best case, this would have been a challenging set of simultaneous transition processes to undertake. In the context of a severe economic crisis, that was made, all of this was made very much more difficult. No one knew, of course, what these transition processes would lead to. The West had its own hopes and aspirations, which it wished to support. It hoped that the outcome would be countries with the rule of law, with democracy, with a vibrant and active civil society, and civic nations, if you like, not ethno-nationalism, but forms of civic nationalism for looking at identity. So from Marx to market, as it was sometimes said at the time. And then there were choices in foreign policy, of course. New countries need not only new systems, but new sets of external relations with their neighbors. And that includes the matter of borders, international borders as well. And I'll come back to that very briefly at the end. It's a range of scenarios that were set out early on among those trying to make predictions about what this unprecedented process of change would produce. And it seems to me we've had 30 years on, neither the best outcomes nor the worst outcomes of the range that was sort of plausibly sketched out at the time. Again, the West's hopes are very, very clear. For a long time, there was this process was defined in terms of transitology to democracy, to markets. In effect, a subset of the end of history. This would be the sort of part of the messy but inevitable mopping up of the end of history. And the West's aspirations were to aid and support that. And in grand strategic terms, this was sometimes defined, especially in the United States, as a shift in strategy from Cold War containment to post-Cold War integration, integrating these new states into a wider Euro-Atlantic community. So from containment to integration. Western priorities to some degree shifted, or at least were complicated, it seems to me, by the post-9/11 security agenda, at least with respect to engagement with some parts of the post-Soviet space, perhaps Central Asia more so than others. Some might argue that there were some uncomfortable compromises, possibly moral compromises to be made when commitments to democracy in particular and civil rights were overlain by the security concerns about dealing with the problems in Afghanistan. I'll leave it for others to comment on that. Increasingly over time, it seems to me, the West ceased to be the only game in town. Other external factors and influences increasingly intruded on these countries and the choices that they made. The rise of China, of course, and that's very much on the minds of many now, especially again in Central Asia, though perhaps not only. The global financial crash and the difficulties that followed from that, and of course the resurgence of Russia as well. So underlying the complexity and uncertainty in the range of possible outcomes that were plausible. That's my first point. My second point is really a question to ask, perhaps provocatively, 30 years on, how much influence really did the West have? Or is it the case that the most important outcomes that we've seen were a consequence of domestic factors and choices, rather than the West's hopes, agendas, and the resources it brought to trying to implement those? How far, as a larger point perhaps, can the West really hope to shape and influence the domestic developments of other countries? Securing the West's foreign policy interests, yes, that's a different matter. And George touched upon the deep security concerns, particularly regarding nuclear issues that were very live at the time. And it seems to me those have been dealt with very effectively and very successfully. A remarkable achievement that could have turned out very different and much worse. But if we look at the domestic systemic transitions, it's not at all clear to me how significant the West's role really was. I would draw a contrast here between the post-Soviet states on the one hand and the states of Central Eastern Europe on the other. In those states, the Eastern Bloc, so to speak, the Eastern European part of that, the commitment to joining the EU was very clear early on, and that gave the EU great leverage in crafting, shaping incentives that incentivized those countries to reform their domestic political and economic orders in line with the acquis of the EU. The leverage is very clear, but it seems to me there's no comparator is looking a little further east. And in preparation for this discussion today, I did last night look up the Freedom House scores for the post-Soviet countries, and I found that nearly all of them were lower. We should say those countries are less free now than they were in 1993. Georgia and Ukraine are about the same. The only country which is clearly and unambiguously improved is Moldova. Now, does that mean that that all that Western aid, assistance, support, democracy promotion was of no significance at all? I wouldn't go that far. One might argue that had the West not made those commitments, the record would be worse still. Okay, we need to compare the reality today with the hypothetical alternative if the West had turned its back on democracy promotion and so on. But at first glance, at the very least, it's a sobering and possibly humbling observation to make, to compare those scores. Economically, I think it's different. I think technical assistance really did play an important role, and not only by Western governments, but the role of Western foreign direct investment in particular, very, very significant indeed in some cases. I'd single out the contribution that the major Western oil and gas companies have made to Kazakhstan's development in particular. But again, let's come back to my provocation here. I would at least offer the thought that most, and certainly the most important things about the 30 years of systemic change in the countries of this region has been a consequence of national leadership choices rather than international influences, and in particular the West's influences. That means there have been surprises, there's been contingency, because you cannot predict, you cannot control what national leaders do. And if you go back to some of the expectations forming in the early 90s that were not realized in practice, there's a lot of Central Asian expertise here. So a lot of people are saying Uzbekistan would be the leader of Central Asia. It was best positioned to play the dominant role there and be a potential success story. As we know, that did not turn out to be the case. as I see it, Kazakhstan has been the great overperformer of the region. So if we look at the hands that these new states were dealt, and then the way that they dealt them, the leadership choices that played the initial post-Soviet hand, it seems to me that Kazakhstan is a good example of a country that has, through leadership choices, has done better than most and better than we might have expected. There is one exception I'd offer here, and George touched upon it. He said that in 1992 there was no real appetite for significant early support, particularly financial support. And this is to me, one of the what ifs of this period of history. Supposing if the West had been much more generous, that period 1992, 1993, perhaps some of the most difficult aspects of the transition depression with all of its traumas might have been avoided. And I'm struck in particular by the fact that, and it sounds like George has spoken to him recently, but I've seen Andrei Kozyrev in print being unsparingly critical of the West's lack of generosity in that early period. And this is the most pro-Western foreign minister that Russia has ever had. And he is again, very, very forceful, is critical by how little the West at that early key moment did to support the very early post-Soviet transition period. So perhaps in all of this, there is a large, without exception, potential exception, there's a larger humbling lesson for the West. One might argue it's been buried, the hopes have been buried definitively on the plains and in the mountains of Afghanistan over the past few months. There are severe limits to the extent the West can really shape the domestic choices of other countries. My third and final point is that 30 years on, it's quite clear that there are significant Soviet legacies and even in some respect a return or attempts by some to return to some patterns of the past. To put it another way, those molten pieces that fly out from the Big Bang have not kind of cooled and hardened into a solar system. There are still, with any degree of stability, there's still a great deal of uncertainty in play. I mentioned the point about borders earlier, the importance of new states forming new borders. We've had challenges to borders of various kinds. Even the past year, we've had a small but nasty skirmish on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. We've had the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, and in the Eastern Slavic region, borders are being probed and challenged in various ways. You've seen what Belarus has been doing with respect to its EU borders, not challenging them as such, but certainly de facto aggressing against them by through the use of migrants. And of course, we see Russia more or less openly, quite openly, in fact, challenging and continuing to challenge Ukraine's sovereignty and statehood. And recall, it was the Ukrainian independence referendum that precipitated the breakup of the Soviet Union. So when you see attempt by Russia, so it seems to me, to challenge that outcome, that event, historic event, 30 years ago. Domestically too, we see, at least in Belarus and Russia, a greater degree of authoritarianism than any time since perhaps the early or mid 80s. So there are attempts at revanchism, in a sense, at least partially trying to deny or undermine the events of 30 years ago. And that's disquieting, of course. If I'll conclude on a note of hope, though, it's that if we are looking across the range of the dimensions of transition, the one that seems to me, or among the few that are most consistent and most significant, so identity formation, nation discovery or invention. There is absolutely no appetite among the populations of any of these countries to return to anything like a Soviet past. And generational change and the new values that a new generation, definitively post-Soviet generation brings, will continue to propel that. So any revanchist Soviet-light aspiration to turn back the clock, either domestically in respect of new authoritarianism or internationally in respect of trying to challenge post-Soviet borders, that seems out of time now and does not enjoy wide support. I'll conclude there, but I look forward to the discussion very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. What a wealth of insights. And I hope we can touch upon some of them in the discussion, but you just started 15 new panels, I think, with what you said and the questions you posed. And I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine, because Ukraine clearly was a pivotal, very pivotal republic. Back then, kind of really, that's how the collapse indeed happened, and it seems to be pivotal nowadays as well. So let me go to Laura, and Laura, the floor is yours, and I'll be very grateful if you can also reflect on the question that Nigel posed. Can the West shape domestic politics, domestic political development in Eurasia?
Thank you, Nargis. I'm not sure I'll quite address that question, because I think while my fellow panelists are addressing the broad sweep of systemic change in the region, I would really like to speak about my experiences as a Westerner and how my engagement with people from Eurasia has shaped me. In other words, I want to talk about power, and not power in the sense of a struggle for dominance, but power as an iterative process of the mutual construction and deconstruction of knowledge. And you will hear, no doubt, echoes of the broader geopolitical trends in my own experience, because as we all recognize, what becomes the sweep of history is always also embodied and expressed through the actions of individuals. In 1988, I was among a group of naive Midwestern college students who signed on to a January term trip to the Soviet Union. We found ourselves one day in Moscow at the Komsomol headquarters, speaking in English with a polite group of young people who we thought of as commies. Our ideas were right, and theirs were just propaganda. But that encounter began the deconstruction of my Cold War knowledge and my identity. And I began to see that had I been born in Moscow in similar circumstances, I might well have been among this group. Then in the early 1990s, when I was in graduate school, I wanted to study Uzbekistan, but it didn't take me very long to read the approximately 3 books in English that were relevant to a sociologist. So I ran out of options because, as you may recall, we had no Google back then. But I took the advice of my advisor, who told me, just go. So I did. I arrived in 1995 to Uzbekistan, knowing no one in the country and feeling more than a little terrified. But my gracious new acquaintances gently shuttled me through the network of artists and intellectuals who were engaged in the still new project of constructing and deconstructing Uzbek national identity. They welcomed me as a witness to their project of reworking Uzbekistan's official project reworking Uzbekistan's official relationships with history, with Russia, and with the West. Western engagement, embodied by me, was seen by them as a signal that Uzbekistan was opening up to the world, and that in the world, in turn, was seeing it. I became, in many ways, their American in this time period, but I was reminded again and again that I was a guest, and that I had a role in this historical moment that was not of my choosing, that was more akin to that of a mascot than to the researcher that I had thought I'd come there to be. And eventually I understood that the data that I was collecting was actually inseparable from how my interlocutors perceived me in this role. So it was the artistic intelligentsia of Uzbekistan, not Michel Foucault, who taught me that knowledge is the product of relations of power. In the 2000s, I engaged in a series of partnerships with scholars and students in Central Asia, but in the era of counterterrorism and after the wave of color revolutions, My engagement with Uzbekistan's nation building project was no longer welcome. The mascot was now considered a spy, and it broke my heart. Migrating my work to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I found that my role was not to be their American. They constructed me instead as a teacher and mentor. And over time, my engagement with them transformed me into a facilitator. For the last 10 years, I've been much more interested in what my colleagues from the region have had to say about themselves than anything I could possibly say about them. And I've done what I could to make sure that their voices were heard, though much more is left to be done on that point. I guess I wish that Western engagement in the region had more closely paralleled this part of my biography. I wish that our governments and their democracy assistance programs in particular had realized it was time 10 years ago to become facilitators instead of teachers. When I joined the U.S. Agency for International Development in 2014, I found myself marshaling evidence against a skepticism about the effectiveness of democracy programs in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that showed no will for reform. Meeting in Kazakhstan with social movement activists in 2018, it was so clear to me that the problem was not how much we were spending on democracy assistance, but how we were spending it. Even good facilitation is not that expensive, but when spending is a metric of performance, as it is in many government agencies, there's not much incentive to learn how to do small things well. Now I engage with the region as an international NGO advocate of amplifying local voices, of facilitating local processes, and I hope of doing small things well. And again, there's a mutual constitution between my individual experience and the broader relations of power at play. In outlining her vision for USAID in November 2021, and again in her remarks at last week's Democracy Summit, Administrator Samantha Power advocated tapping into the knowledge and experience of local communities. She said, as Americans with a fraught history of living up to our own values, we've got to approach this work with intention and humility. But the entire development community needs to interrogate the traditional power dynamics of donor-driven development and look for ways to amplify the local voices of those who too often have been left out of the conversation. And she went on to lay out specific policies that will help USAID put local communities in the lead. So I look forward to seeing how this kind of engagement with Eurasia will constitute my role in the coming era. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the West should engage and should promote democracy and human rights in Eurasia, but it should do it better. Is it
yes,
correct?
Yes, I think it's about how development assistance works, how democracy assistance works, what incentives are in place for the people who are planning these programs, and the relationship they have to the local interlocutors who are the ones carrying out the development of democracy in the first place.
But should it do it throughout the Eurasian space, and why should it do it? If you, I know it's a giant question, but if you could reply in a sort of within 2 minutes.
Well, we should do it because the people in Eurasia want it, right? But I think putting them in the lead and serving more as a facilitator of the kinds of processes that they find to be important, the issues that they need to develop, and the constituencies that especially people who are, technical experts in these countries need to develop better relationships with their constituencies and not be so oriented to the priorities of international donors.
Okay, I think we'll get back to that. Now let's go to Bruce. Bruce, what are your thoughts?
Okay, thank you, Nargis, and thanks to the Davis Center for organizing this and inviting me. I'm only going to speak about Central Asia too, and what I'm going to really focus on is, what I've heard from the people and what I've seen, over 30 plus years of going out there and how they view the West and how that's kind of evolved over time. As we've heard, the 1990s were challenging in a lot of ways, but it was a great time for the West. because if you were in Central Asia, I mean, who else do you really turn to at a time like that, right? Russia's, the Soviet Union's fallen apart. Russia's not in any better position or situation economically in terms of maybe in terms of reorganizing their government. But anyway, they're clearly not going to be a big help. This is before China was ascendant, so that wasn't much of an option in any way. They had just been the enemy in the Soviet years, so this is not anyone you're going to turn to for help. So of course, the hopes were that the West would come in and do something for them and help them out, and the attitude was very positive toward Western engagement and Western involvement in their own affairs. Just to run through all this stuff, in the 1990s, we know that Tajikistan had a civil war from 1992 to 1997. So while there was some Western engagement with Tajikistan, the situation there was so bad at times, and Russia had its military bases there and was helping them out. So there wasn't a huge amount of opportunity for the West to, get a solid footprint down. Turkmenistan became more, I'm just going to say, isolationist and eccentrically run at the moment. So that was also, kind of a country that didn't, less and less kind of embrace the West. But Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan pretty much opened their doors to Western governments, and as we heard, also Western businesses, Western NGOs, and even Western media outlets. And of course, I work for Europe Radio Liberty, and we still have bureaus in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So this is one of the legacies of that time, is we're still around out in those countries. Now, I mentioned there was a lot potentially that these countries could gain from the West. What they wanted, obviously, was financing and investment more than anything, as well as having someone who could kind of guarantee their sovereignty, right? Just in case Russia did start to recoup and get back on its feet, it was important for them to have foreign partners. And as we've heard, Ambassador Kroll said, they didn't have much experience with foreign policy at the time. So this was another challenge for them among many challenges that they faced. But they really did go out of their way, in the early, pretty much throughout the 90s, to be friends with the West as much as possible. And this is an example I always use, but I think it's relevant to show how much that went. There was a vote in the UN General Assembly in 1995, 1996, and 1997 on a draft resolution calling on the United States to end its embargo on Cuba, right? So 3 countries voted against that resolution, the draft resolution. The United States, of course, Israel, and Uzbekistan, of all countries. So, I mean, this shows the lengths that some countries would go to show that they really wanted to be friends with the United States at that time. Obviously, right after 9/11 and the U.S. Started its engagement, its military operation in Afghanistan, this was probably, the first couple of years after that were probably the zenith of Western influence and engagement really in Central Asia. Unprecedented amounts of Western money and resources were being, poured into the region all of a sudden, to support this effort that was going on just south of the border. Now, the Central Asians were grateful for this, not just for the money, but because what had happened, and certainly the immediate aftermath of the U.S. operation was that it had removed a threat that on the Central Asian border. So the Central Asians were also grateful for that. They didn't have to worry about the Taliban or their own militant groups, which had found safe haven down there. All of a sudden, so they were freed up. I mean, they still people are debating right now what the benefits were for Afghanistan or the West for 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan. But I can tell you for sure that 5 countries anyway that benefited greatly from that were the Central Asian countries, because for that long, suddenly they didn't have to be so concerned about what was happening on their southern border. It freed up time, all kinds of things to expand and develop other areas of their countries. At the same time, this ended up being cutting in totally the opposite direction. In 2005, as we remember, there was violence in the eastern Uzbek city of Andijan. The United States and other Western democracies rightfully criticized that. It was a disproportionate use of violence on the part of the Uzbek government in suppressing a local disorder in the town. The US and other countries called for an independent investigation into what had happened. As a result, Uzbekistan told the US to leave the base they were using in Kyrgyzstan, and cut ties greatly with a number of organizations, not just with the US military, but with a lot of the NGOs started to get kicked out. We had a bureau in Uzbekistan, and we were asked to leave. Other media outlets were asked to leave at the same time. But up until that point, for the people of Central Asia, the US had always been a country that at least said, that they were on their side. And a lot of times this was true. And it was true with the European countries too, that if the Central Asians complained about rights violations, the US and other Western countries would take up that call and press the governments on those issues. Now, post 9/11, this already started to get subordinated to the concerns about security cooperation. But, and I would remind just how long this was true is that 1 week before the events in Andijan, there was a protest by farmers from southern Uzbekistan, not a protest, but a demonstration by farmers from southern Uzbekistan demanding better rights and better terms. And that was held outside the US Embassy in Tashkent, right? So, I mean, people still thought that if you got the attention of the United States and they saw your problem, that they could do something about it, and they would. Now, fast forward a little bit further, in 2008, in April, NATO had a summit in Bucharest, in Romania. And at that time, they were developing the Northern Distribution Network to bring goods back and forth between Afghanistan and Europe. The US and other NATO partners reached a new understanding with Uzbekistan, and decided that they were going to be able to work on some basis or anything of some kind out there to get this Northern Distribution Network running. That was hard on the people in Central Asia. I remember going back after that happened, and they said they already had some doubts when the Iraq campaign started, because of course there was it was being spread that maybe the US and the West in general had this campaign against Islam, and it was against Muslims, and it wasn't, they didn't explain, used a really broad brush to paint what was the motivations of the West out there. But after 2008, when the US and Uzbekistan, the government started cooperating again, I'd got there and people would really, they had the impression that we'd kind of sold out. The West had sold them out. They weren't as important. Western interests in Afghanistan and Western interests in their own security were, and so it was a kind of a new attitude that they had toward really Western engagement at all. And I can give you another example of how April 2010, there was a revolution in Kyrgyzstan, as we know, and Kurmanbek Bakiyev was chased from power as president of Kyrgyzstan. And I went down south. I went out there, and I went down south to Jalalabad and Kyrgyzstan because I knew he would show up there, and he did. And he was going to speak one day on the square in Jalalabad, right? And so I got out there with a bunch of people waiting for him to show up, and everyone saw me. I stick out like a sore thumb in those places. So they came up and asked me where I was from and what I was doing, and I explained all this stuff. And several times before Bakiyev came, from several different groups of people, they asked me if it was true that US troops from the Manas base in Kyrgyzstan were their special forces actually were in Jalalabad to snatch Bakiyev and bring him back to Bishkek. And it sounded ludicrous to me at the time, and even more so now, but I mean, people really believed that was true, and it kind of showed that at least their idea of what the United States was doing in Central Asia had changed. They weren't, they seemed to have this idea that the U.S. military was operating, independently or in concert with the Kyrgyz government in this case, but it was a much more suspicious kind of view of what was happening in Central Asia. Now, and I know we got to wrap this up quick. So anyway, and now we know that China, of course, after the global economic crisis of 2008, they made a huge push into Central Asia. They were already there; they already had projects going, but they made a huge push into Central Asia, and even kind of pushed Russia aside. And still to this day, there's a legacy of that. You mentioned, in the posting of this conference, that the U.S., it seems like the Western influence in the region has kind of faded, especially in light of what happened in Afghanistan in August. I suppose that's true. to some point. But I always looked at Central Asia as a region where they kind of brought in and out different partners. They always have over the 30 years I've been there. Russia was big and still is, but it kind of ebbs and flows, what their influence is. China was big, but it's kind of ebbing. There's a lot of suspicion about Chinese intentions. There's resentment about the way the Chinese government has treated the Uyghurs. Of course, Russia, although they're generally welcome out there and a destination for all kinds of labor migrants, no one wants to be a Russian colony out there again, right? So this is always something in the back of their mind. Similarly with some of these maps you see coming out of China, there's also the fear that maybe China has some kind of designs on Central Asian land out there. And so the West was never really out, but I see that, the West, because of the new way of looking at China and Russia that they have in Central Asia, the West will always have a role in Central Asia because it helps. You've heard this many times that it balances it, but it really does. They need powerful partners to help them preserve their own sovereignty when they have giant neighbors, who are greatly influencing events in their country. Past that, although Russian and Chinese money is welcome in the region, it's run up a huge debt in a lot of these places. And Nargis, because you're working on the same project I was with the EU, that they had their $2 billion Central Asian strategy. But the difference is that the strategy the EU is using builds it looks at renewable projects, other projects that the Central Asians need, but don't run into huge debt when they're built. And that's not true with China and Russia at all. And for example, with Russia saying 2-to-1 in Tajikistan, the hydropower plant there has always been running in the red. And the Russians are still operating that because they built it. It was the build, own, operate, and transfer agreement. But since they've never been able to pay off the debt, Russia's still operating it, and Tajikistan's still in debt for it. And how many projects Central Asians are in debt for to China, I don't even know. So I think the West, there's a big space for the West to have some kind of engagement in Central Asia. They'll never put the kind of money in that Central Asia and China, or that Russia and China do. Who would expect they would? Why would they? That's the question. But they are important to Central Asia, and a lot of the ideas that were put in there by NGOs or, in independent media in the 1990s are still there. And we see even in Uzbekistan when Mirziyoyev came to power, the independent media just took off again. It's there. And it's possible that it can spring up at any time. It just needs a chance, So there's a lot of reasons to keep engaged with Central Asia, and there's a lot of reasons for them to want the West to keep engaged with them. And I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And you raised the most important question. Definitely, Central Asia and the rest of Eurasia needs Western engagement. But does the West need, Central Asia and other parts of Eurasia? And I'm particularly concerned about Central Asia because it's kind of further from the European space, from Europe or Europe. And if it should engage, how it should engage. So maybe if I can invite panelists to give your thoughts, but like really 1-2 minutes, and then we can take a couple of questions before we wrap up. Yes, George.
Yeah, there are quite a lot of interesting and provocative questions. I to be very brief in my reaction to what I've heard is that I think we have to think of, and I kept trying to think of this myself when I was out there in Central Asia, for focusing on that and elsewhere, is local politics matter, and they are decisive. And for another country, another government, another culture to, as it were, feel that it can insert itself and become a player in that local, the political system in there, that's fraught with a lot of peril, if you will. And it is an engagement that has, there are people in the society that will say, yes, you should be there. And if a demonstration in front of the American embassy in Tashkent is something, but on the other hand, that shows that the American embassy or the American presence, and certainly in the eyes of the government of the country is playing a role in the domestic politics, the domestic situation there. And that is the question of, is it appropriate or whatever? I mean, as a diplomat, the rules of the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations state quite clearly, embassies in countries are not to involve themselves in the internal affairs of the host country, period. And yet, we, however, feel that we have to be engaged in this because there's a moral requirement to do so. But the rules of the game, that yes, this was in the 1960s when there was a Cold War, were basically to try to prevent the kind of conflicts you could have when another country and its agencies become involved in this. And I would say also, looking at Central Asia in particular and elsewhere, they have their own politics, even under the Soviet period, basically dealing with Moscow in the sense of how to sort of pull the wool over their eyes on many things, whilst they have their own really Republican politics and clan politics. And so that when Moscow may have thought, as Russia may have thought, that it had a lot of influence, in reality, it was really a lot less than they thought they had. And it was really interesting to see how the governments, for instance, the new ones of the republics, whether it's Nazarbayev's government or Karimov in Central Asia, were able to look at as it were, the West and others as being kind of, okay, this is like Moscow again trying to involve itself. So we need to control this. And when you talk about, okay, the business, the energy companies that came into Kazakhstan, it was quite clear that they were allowed to come in and have their contract on the basis they do not interfere in the internal politics of Kazakhstan. And they didn't, and they don't to this day. If they did, they would be out. And there were, a lot of, unspoken, as it were, arrangements. And so, again, these governments and their leaderships, as well as the bureaucracies themselves, wanted to preserve, quote unquote, their independence and sovereignty. And this was very important to them. It was in the Soviet period, and I think it was in this period. And I don't think that was quite understood by Western governments and agencies, which always had conditions on the governmental things of you must do X, Y, and Z, which is why a Marshall Plan really wasn't going to work. I mean, the idea of putting a lot of money in it, there would have been a lot of conditions and a lot of bureaucracy. And let's face it, the bureaucracies in these republics themselves were in most respects opposed to even the Gorbachevian reforms, which kind of brought about the end of the Soviet Union because of the anti-reform and anti-Gorbachev, which I would say is also the personal relationship or lack thereof of Yeltsin and Gorbachev kind of led to that issue. But anyways, I would just point that out, that that local politics really matter, and you have to understand it and work with it. On just one more thing on aid and assistance, I think Laura is very right. What I saw was successful was not so much going in political parties and things of this nature, but one example in Uzbekistan, even when I was there, Karimov was present. This was after Andijan and everything. And also when I was in Belarus, is if you had neighborhood projects like with farmers and the like, that would just allow them to, providing them with the technical expertise to increase their crop yields, the use of bees, these things and types of fruits that they used to. This sort of spawned a whole sort of cooperative effort among farmers, as it did among neighborhoods, even in Belarus, on very concrete issues that then kind of expanded, where they were empowered themselves to improve themselves with the support of their governments. And that is something I think that was the role of an assistance, is giving them that spark, a little bit of what is the technology, getting them with other farmers and the like, where they share experiences and learn. American farmers learned a lot from Uzbek farmers. So I think, though that localism is very important to keep in mind. Thanks.
Yes, great points. Well, just one little thing here. The governments of these post-Soviet republics, they made certain promises, and they took commitments, as members of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and all that. So, and also establishing diplomatic relations with the US. There were these 5 conditions, right? And democracy was part of it. So, of course, they committed without knowing what they were, fully knowing what they were committing to. But there is that. It wasn't just kind of imposed on them. But here I'm opening another.
Yeah, they committed to it, but like they committed to many things in the Soviet Union and the Soviet Constitution. But then, right. The realities is how do you work within it?
Yeah, and current realities are quite different from realities in the early 90s in this regard, in terms of what are the norms and what's the biggest game in town. Nigel, what are your thoughts? Also, very briefly. So
yeah, very briefly. So. I'm entirely sympathetic to the spirit of colleagues' remarks. In particular, I think George has just echoed it, but Laura put it very well. Facilitating, not teaching. I think that's very important, and building capacity and technical assistance. Those things have been, I think, at the more effective end of the range of Western ways of engaging. A further example, it seems to me, would be the assistance given, the training to Ukrainian media in the late 90s and early 2000s, which really bore fruit, it seems to be, in some of the crucial sort of decisive moments of 2004, when you got some journalists, including television journalists, really for the first time saying what they really felt about what was going on, and the decisive phase when things were still unsettled. I mean, it still seemed that Yanukovych might steal that victory, and of course he didn't. And what happened in the mass media was in part responsible for that. On much larger scale, and early interventions, I think Bill Courtney has posed a question about this. It's a genuinely hard call, and yes, there were reasonable misgivings in 1990, 1991, when the Soviet Union was still extant, about whether large immediate sort of fiscal assistance would be squandered or wasted. I think things are very different when you're looking at 1992, though, and the new, again, the most radical pro-market and frankly pro-Western government that Russia, the Russia's ever had. And we'll never know, of course, but it seems to me that it was essentially a risk worth taking. It's that was a government committed to doing the right things under unbelievably strained conditions. The fact that people like Kozyrev and Gaidar have criticized the West for its lack of generosity at that time certainly makes me think that there was a path not taken. Not that it would have been a path of roses, but it might have made things easier and, for example, staved off for a time the mounting resistance in the Russian legislature, where it manifested itself as early as April 1992. There's more to say about all that, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, but Nigel, how about now? Should there be stronger engagement by the West, or lighter? What's kind of
investment in civil society?
Engagement. Investment in society.
That is very important, but and also, I mean, if we're looking at ways of constraining states, I do think sanctions play an important role. If it's a matter at this stage not of coaxing and supporting hopeful transition, but of trying to constrain and limit adversarial behavior, then I do think sanctions and other measures of economic statecraft have a role to play. But again, that may be a separate discussion at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So shaping political development through engagement with societies, primarily, that's the... Yeah. Okay, thank you. Laura, what's your take?
I yield my time to any additional audience questions we have to squeeze in.
Bruce?
I just say that I'm actually looking forward to the post-Afghan relationship between Central Asia and the West. I mean, it was in the 90s, and then, like I said, for a while after the start of the U.S.-led Operation Afghanistan, it seemed like the balance was way on the Western side. And then as the West became more dependent upon Central Asia for their security concerns in Afghanistan, it kind of switched back to where the Central Asians had a lot more leverage. And I think it's good that there is no, that the Western presence in Afghanistan and military presence is over. And it gives both sides a chance to, reset their relationship on something that, is much more equal and looks for common ground between the two sides, as opposed to one needing the other more than the other needs the one. So.
Thank you. Okay, let's take 5 more minutes. Let's go a little bit over time, and we have questions to panelists. First question to you, George, and I'll read all the questions so that then we can have a string of replies. George, in the 1990s, some critics said that the US was treating Yeltsin's Russia better than the non-Russian republics. Others pointed to strong US support for the sovereignty and independence of all the republics. What is your perspective? And that's a question from Ambassador Courtney. There is a question, well, Nigel, you tackled your question, I think. And there is a question also to whoever wants to take it. Can it be said that Eurasianism, posed here as strategic Sovietism in post-Soviet countries, be a reaction to the saturation of foreign democracy and a desire, democracy in quotation marks, and a desire for the social, politically, and economically familiar? If so, how could this inform predictions about the West's future interactions with these post-Soviet countries? And Laura, I would ask you to address it. And question to Bruce, given Turkey's soured relationship with NATO and Europe, and given their precarious position between Russia and China, what is the likelihood that the Turkic Council will develop a pan-Turkic military alliance? Okay, George?
Right. Yes, I'd say that in the 90s, it was pretty clear that for the United States administration, first Bush and then particularly in the Clinton administration, that the highest level focus was on Russia and the relationship with Russia. I think Bill knows this quite well. And getting attention to the other republics was difficult. I mean, it was one of the reasons why this the office that I worked in of the ambassador at large for the new independent states was really focused on taking care of what was called the parish of the non-Russian, the republics other than Russia, whereas Strobe Talbot as the Deputy Secretary of State and the President himself, Clinton, and that were deeply involved dealing directly with the Yeltsin government and the many calls and things like that took place, because that was focused as the most important country. And then there were the structure of it, the mechanisms of having the vice president chair these commissions with Nazarbayev. The Uzbeks wanted something like that, but they got a lower level of with the assistant secretary or with Collins himself, who was the ambassador at large when I was there as well. And so, yes, there was this pecking order, but there were political pushes, particularly because of the Ukrainian diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, and the like, of forcing attention as well as resources to go to those republics, because they had backers in Washington that would push for that for greater attention. But places like Belarus and much of Central Asia and the like were basically important rhetorically. And I have to say that the Pentagon had much more interest in Central Asia than the State Department, because of the interest in developing a security relationship with these countries more so than the domestic, if you will, the non-military departments of the U.S. government.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I would just say that the earlier phase of engagement may be characterized as a pursuit of institutional isomorphism, that we have ideas about what a democracy should look like, and we would like to create that democracy in your country, in our image. But I think, I keep turning back to the Democracy Summit. The sort of global discourse about that is that we actually have some problems in common, and maybe we need to be more humble in understanding what does lead to an enduring democracy in our own countries and in other countries, and think through more carefully what are our theories about this and how are they supported by evidence, and taking the perspective more that we all have something to learn about how healthy democracies can be built. So I think that characterization that there are these two different eras we're looking at, perhaps punctuated in between with an era of sort of disconnection. But yeah, hopefully we are renewing some common pursuits of democracy.
That's in line with the argument made by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes in their book, in which they discuss the sort of rise of illiberalism, that now that there is this competition, it's actually good for the kind of rethinking and strengthening the set of ideas that come with the liberalism. Okay, Bruce, on Turkey Council, now it's renamed organization, but yeah.
So, I mean, it's an interesting development. Obviously, some form of this has existed for 30 years, and certainly when I was there, 1992 and 3, when I was living there, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyz, the Turkmen. I mean, they really were hoping that Turkey was going to be a much bigger influence, a much bigger player in Central Asia. Turkey had its own problems, but that's one that they look to. The Turkish television is still real popular out there. Turkish literature is popular out there. I mean, they see themselves as being part of a big, one big group of people, and they really do look at it that way. The fact that Turkey is able to flex its muscle on the international stage a lot more than it has been previously brings kind of a new dynamic to the whole relationship that they have with them. Turkey's active in Syria, Libya, played a role in Nagorno-Karabakh on the Azerbaijani side. And it was mentioned, Nigel mentioned that there was a conflict on the Tajik-Kyrgyz border, and the Kyrgyz took the worst end of that. And since then, Turkey's provided the same kind of drones to Kyrgyzstan that they had provided to Azerbaijan. So how far this is going to go is going to be interesting, because inevitably they're going to start stepping on other people's toes, Russia and China, namely. But at the same time, because they have better historical links with Turkey, the people of Central Asia have better historical links with the people of Turkey than they do with China or Russia. So it's going to be an interesting relationship to watch. As our military alliance, I think we're way early to say that's going to happen soon. But like I said, you can see where this could be a problem a little bit further down the line.
Yes, well, in the 90s, Turkey was seen as this important agent of Westernization and democratization. And now it doesn't seem to be the case. What do you foresee in the future?
Well, the interesting thing is, in the 90s, I think the West really wanted Turkey. A lot of countries wanted Turkey to have that kind of role. They were in NATO and they were cooperating with Europe, and they saw, this was an in for them. This was something that nobody else could play, and say you're cousins, so Turkey should have been the country to do that. Now sadly, the West doesn't have as good relationship with Turkey at the moment as they did in the 1990s, probably either. But that will likely change. But like I said, I think Turkey's a natural ally for a lot of those countries. It's going to shake things up, though. I mentioned the conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and that Turkey had given Kyrgyzstan drones. Well, that's if you're Tajikistan, this is bad. And who do you turn to now to balance the situation out? Iran, China, so I don't think Turkish influence in Central Asia will diminish certainly anytime soon, and I would imagine that it's going to increase. It's just a question of how far it goes before they start hitting other, like I said, stepping on other people's toes is the best way I can put it, where they run into conflict with some of these other countries that have already established their presence in the region and don't like the fact that, really someone with a much better, probably better deal is coming into the region all of a sudden, or at least a better, if not better deal, one that's more acceptable to the majority of the people out there.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to wrap up this discussion because it's been quite incredible. I think we all learned a lot and have a lot of food for thought. Let me thank the panelists for joining and making this exciting discussion, and let me thank the audiences for joining us and my colleagues at the Davis Center, Chris Martin and Matthew Kokines, who made this possible. And I want to wish happy holidays to everybody. This is the last seminar in the last event in our series this calendar year, but we will be back